Imran the spice merchant locked the door of his shop in the souk of Zara just as the last call to evening prayer faded over the rooftops, and he never opened it again. His neighbors would later say they heard nothing unusual that night, no cry, no struggle, only the ordinary creak of the old wooden shutters settling against the desert wind that rolled down from the dunes every evening once the sun had finally surrendered the sky. Yet when his apprentice arrived before dawn to open the shop for the morning trade, he found Imran seated upright in his own chair behind the counter. His eyes burned black and hollow as if a flame had passed directly through them, his mouth frozen open in a silent shape that no living man should ever be forced to hold. There was no fire in the shop. There was no mark of struggle, no overturned baskets of cardamom or saffron, nothing disturbed except a fine layer of pale sand that had somehow gathered across the floor despite the shop's door and shutters having been locked from the inside the entire night. The apprentice, a boy of perhaps 14, ran screaming into the street before the sun had fully cleared the eastern wall of the city, and by the time the mutasib arrived to investigate, half the souk already stood whispering at a careful distance from the shop's open door. No one in Zara yet understood what had truly happened that night, though many would come, before the season ended, to understand it far too well. Tariq ibn Salim had served as the city's mutasib for less than a year, a young man entrusted with the unglamorous work of inspecting weights, settling market disputes, and keeping the peace among merchants who trusted no authority more than they trusted their own scales. He had not expected, in accepting the post, that his duties would ever extend to investigating a death so strange that the city physician himself stood outside the shop refusing to enter a second time. Tariq examined the body carefully, noting details the panicked crowd outside had already begun exaggerating into something far beyond what he himself could confirm. The burns around Imran's eyes were real enough, the flesh blackened in a pattern too precise and too symmetrical to belong to any accidental flame. The sand on the floor was real as well, fine and pale, unlike the coarser grit that normally blew in from the streets, more closely resembling the deep desert sand found only far beyond the city's irrigated fields. He asked the apprentice, still trembling in the doorway, whether his master had mentioned anything unusual in recent weeks. The boy hesitated, then admitted that Imran had been quietly expanding his storage cellar beneath the shop for nearly a month, working alone at night because he did not wish his rivals to know he intended to store a larger shipment of goods before the next caravan season. The city physician, a careful and normally unflappable man named Hakim Idris, finally agreed to examine the body once Tariq assured him the room held no immediate danger. Hakim turned the dead merchant's head gently in his hands, studying the burned eyes with a furrowed brow, and admitted, after a long silence, that he had never in 30 years of practice encountered an injury resembling this one. He told Tariq plainly that whatever had killed Imran had not done so through any natural illness, poison, or physical violence he could identify through ordinary medical knowledge. Word of the strange death spread through the souk faster than Tariq could manage, and by midday the market elders had gathered at the edge of the cordoned shop, demanding answers Tariq did not yet possess. Several among them offered their own explanations freely, blaming bad water, blaming spoiled spices Imran himself had been selling, blaming simple heatstroke despite the season's relatively mild temperatures. Tariq listened to each theory without argument, recognizing that fear made people eager to settle on any explanation, however unlikely, that did not require them to consider something far worse. He returned to the shop alone once the crowd finally dispersed for the midday heat, intending to examine the cellar Imran had been secretly expanding, certain that whatever had happened to the merchant had begun somewhere beneath his own feet rather than within the shop itself. The cellar stairs descended further than Tariq expected for a simple storage expansion, the air growing noticeably cooler and stiller the lower he climbed, carrying a faint mineral smell that reminded him, uncomfortably, of very old stone exposed for the first time in centuries. At the bottom, he found fresh digging tools scattered across the floor, abandoned mid-task, and a section of the cellar wall broken through into a narrow chamber that did not appear on any structural record Tariq had ever seen for buildings in this quarter of the city. Within the chamber, his lamp revealed a circular stone seal, cracked cleanly down its center, lying half buried in loose rubble that had clearly fallen when Imran's digging finally breached whatever had been sealed behind it. Strange symbols, worn nearly smooth by age, still traced faint patterns across the seal's broken surface, patterns Tariq did not recognize from any script used in the city's current age. He stood for a long moment in the cool, still air of that hidden chamber, understanding with a growing unease that Imran had not died from any illness, poison, or accident, but from something his own greedy ambition for a larger storeroom had unknowingly unleashed from beneath the ground he walked every day of his life. Tariq sealed the cellar as best he could manage and reported his findings to the wali, the city's governor, a cautious and politically minded man named Rashid who listened to the account with visible reluctance to accept its implications. Rashid suggested, predictably, that the broken seal likely belonged to some forgotten cistern or storage vault from an earlier era of the city's construction, and that Tariq should focus his investigation on more practical explanations for the merchant's death rather than indulging the superstitious fears already spreading through the souk. Tariq did not argue the point directly, recognizing that the wali's caution stemmed less from genuine disbelief than from a desire to avoid the kind of public panic that might disrupt the upcoming caravan season, the city's primary source of revenue and prestige among its neighboring settlements. He left the governor's chambers with his concerns largely unaddressed, though he noticed, in Rashid's tightly folded hands and the careful way he avoided meeting Tariq's eyes directly, a deeper worry the governor himself was not yet willing to voice aloud. That night, walking home through the quiet streets near the souk, Tariq heard, just at the edge of his hearing, a low sound carried on the evening wind, something between a whisper and a distant, rolling laugh that seemed to follow him for nearly 2 full blocks before fading away into ordinary silence. 3 days after Imran's death, a second victim was found in the perfume seller's quarter on the opposite side of the city, far enough from the souk that no obvious connection seemed possible at first glance. The victim was a young bride named Hanan, found in her own courtyard the morning after her wedding celebration, her eyes burned in the same precise, symmetrical pattern that had marked Imran's death, fine pale desert sand scattered across the courtyard's tiled floor despite the household's gates having remained locked throughout the night. The bride's elderly grandmother answered before anyone else could, her voice trembling with a fear that went deeper than simple grief. She told Tariq that the household's well had been deepened the previous month by workers hired to address a dry season shortage, and that those same workers had reported, in passing comments she had dismissed at the time as foolish superstition, breaking through into an old chamber lined with strange carved stone before sealing it back over with fresh earth and stone of their own. 2 separate disturbances, 2 separate deaths, both connected by sealed chambers broken open after long undisturbed centuries, convinced Tariq that whatever force had killed Imran and Hanan was neither isolated nor accidental but instead something deliberately bound beneath the city long ago, recently and unknowingly freed by ordinary people seeking nothing more than larger storerooms and deeper wells. He returned to the governor with this expanded evidence, hoping the pattern itself might finally overcome Rashid's reluctance to act. Rashid listened more carefully this time, his composure visibly strained by the second death occurring so soon after the first, but he remained unwilling to authorize any public acknowledgement of supernatural involvement, fearing the panic such an admission would cause among both the city's residents and the merchants whose caravans depended on Zara's reputation as a safe and prosperous trading post. He agreed only to quietly authorize Tariq's continued private investigation, instructing him to proceed with discretion and to bring any further findings directly to the governor's chambers rather than discussing them openly in the souk. Tariq left this second meeting more frustrated than the first, understanding clearly that he would receive little official support for whatever true danger now stalked the city's quiet nights, and that whatever further deaths might occur in the coming weeks would likely fall, in practice, entirely upon his own limited investigation to prevent. Seeking knowledge beyond what the city's official records or his own training as a market inspector could provide, Tariq sought out Hakim Nasir, an elderly scholar known throughout Zara for his deep study of old texts, astrology, and the considerably stranger lore that most respectable citizens preferred to dismiss as little more than entertaining superstition. Hakim received him in a small study cluttered floor to ceiling with scrolls and bound manuscripts, listening to Tariq's account of both deaths with an expression that grew steadily more grave as the details accumulated. When Tariq finished, Hakim sat in silence for a long moment before speaking, choosing his words with obvious care. He told Tariq that the city of Az-Zar had been built, many centuries earlier, atop the ruins of a far older settlement, one whose final ruler, a sorcerer king remembered in only the most obscure regional chronicles, had reportedly bound a powerful and dangerous djinn somewhere beneath the ground before his own kingdom fell to ruin and was eventually buried beneath the dust that later generations built their new city upon without ever fully understanding what still slept beneath their streets. Hakim warned Tariq that jinn, unlike the simple demons of common storytelling, possessed complex natures, capable of both terrible cruelty and, under the right circumstances, a kind of reasoning intelligence that made them considerably more dangerous than any ordinary predator precisely because they could think, plan, and remember old grievances across centuries that would reduce any mortal memory to mere legend. Hakim's library held fragments of the old chronicles he had described, though much of the relevant material had survived only in damaged, partial form, copied and recopied by scribes across many generations who had themselves understood increasingly little of what they preserved. He showed Tariq one such fragment, describing the sorcerer king only by the title Malik Zuhair, who had reportedly captured a jinn of considerable power and bound it beneath his palace using a ritual seal and a ring forged specifically for that purpose, intending to use the creature's power to secure his own rule against rivals both mortal and otherwise. The fragment ended abruptly, the remaining pages lost to time or deliberate destruction, offering no clear account of what had ultimately happened to either Malik Zuhair's kingdom or the bound jinn itself, beyond a final, ominous line stating only that the binding had been completed at great cost and that future generations would be wise never to disturb what slept beneath the old palace grounds. Tariq asked Hakim whether he knew the location of those old palace grounds relative to the modern city. Hakim's answer confirmed what Tariq had already begun to suspect with growing dread. The old chronicles placed the palace's ruins directly beneath the heart of what was now Az-Zar's central souk, precisely where Imran's shop, and its illegally expanded cellar, happened to stand. That evening, as Tariq walked home through streets already growing quiet with the early curfew most residents had begun observing since Imran's death, he became aware of a presence following him at a careful distance, glimpsed only in fragments at the edge of his vision, a shape darker than the surrounding shadows that seemed to flow rather than walk along the alley walls. He quickened his pace without looking back directly, recalling Hakim's warning that jinn, unlike ordinary predators, could think and plan, and that drawing direct attention to his own awareness of being watched might prove more dangerous than simply reaching the safety of his own locked door as quickly as possible. He reached his home without incident, but as he secured the door behind him, he heard, clearly this time, a low voice carried on the night wind outside, speaking words in an old dialect he only partially understood, though the tone carried an unmistakable note of mocking amusement that left him certain the creature responsible for both deaths had noticed his investigation and did not yet consider him a serious threat. He slept poorly that night, troubled by dreams of burning eyes and shifting sand that he could not fully remember upon waking, though he retained a clear impression that something ancient and patient had begun, deliberately, to take an interest in his continued efforts to understand it. A third death occurred within the week, this time a young guard named Faris who had publicly mocked the growing rumors about a jinn stalking the city, declaring loudly in the souk central square that he feared no spirit and would happily stand watch alone at the cordoned shop where Imran had died if anyone doubted his courage. He was found the following morning slumped against the shop's outer wall, his eyes burned in the same precise pattern, the desert sand scattered around his body despite the dry season having brought no recent windstorm capable of depositing it there naturally. The death of a guard, a man whose duty was supposedly to protect the city rather than fall victim within it, shattered whatever remaining confidence the wali's careful silence had managed to maintain among the general population. Merchants began closing their shops earlier each evening, families kept their children indoors well before sunset, and a current of genuine, unmanageable fear began spreading through Az-Zara faster than any official explanation could hope to contain. Tariq, examining Faris's body alongside the increasingly shaken physician Hakim Idris, noticed one new detail that distinguished this death from the previous two. A faint trail of the same pale sand led away from the body toward the alley's far end, the first physical trace either of them had found suggesting the creature responsible might be tracked, however briefly, by following the path it left behind. Tariq followed the sand trail as far as it remained visible, tracing it through the narrow alley behind the cordon shop and into a section of the city's old quarter that had largely fallen into disuse decades earlier, its buildings crumbling and mostly abandoned except for a handful of elderly residents too poor or too stubborn to relocate elsewhere. The trail finally disappeared at the entrance to an old, disused well, its stone rim worn smooth by centuries of rope and bucket use long since abandoned in favor of newer, deeper wells elsewhere in the city. He peered down into the well's dark depths and felt, even from a safe distance above, the same cool, mineral-laden air he had noticed both in Imran's hidden cellar chamber and in the bride's deepened household well, confirming his growing suspicion that this old, forgotten well connected, somewhere beneath the city's foundations, to the same buried palace chamber Hakim's old chronicle had described. He did not descend the well alone, recognizing the danger of confronting whatever waited below without proper preparation or support, but he marked its location carefully and resolved to bring Hakim and whatever additional protective knowledge the old scholar could offer, before attempting any direct confrontation with the creature responsible for 3 deaths and a city's rapidly escalating fear. Hakim suggested, upon hearing of the old well's connection to the deaths, that Tariq seek the counsel of Sid Amina, an elderly herbalist and spiritual healer living in a modest house near the city's southern gate, known throughout Az Zara for treating cases of jinn affliction that ordinary physicians could not explain or cure. Hakim admitted he had not consulted her himself in many years, owing to a long-standing, unspoken rivalry between scholarly and folk traditions of knowledge that he now recognized, given the circumstances, as a foolish luxury neither of them could afford to maintain. Sid Amina received Tariq cautiously at first, listening to his account of the 3 deaths with the careful, measured attention of someone who had clearly encountered similar troubles before in her long years of practice. When he finished, she told him plainly that what stalked Azizara was no ordinary spirit but a jinn of considerable age and power, one whose binding, if Hakim's old chronicle proved accurate, had likely been broken not merely by accident but by the simple, inevitable erosion of centuries finally giving way beneath the careless digging of ordinary, unsuspecting people. She warned Tariq that jinn bound under such ancient circumstances often carried grievances stretching back to their original captor, and that a jinn freed after centuries of imprisonment might direct its fury not randomly but with deliberate, patient purpose toward anyone connected, even distantly, to the lineage or city that had once held it captive. Sid Amina agreed to accompany Tariq in his investigation, explaining that her own family had practiced protective rituals against jinn affliction for several generations, knowledge passed down to her from her grandmother, who had herself learned it from an even older tradition whose original source Amina could no longer trace with any certainty. She told Tariq that confronting the creature directly without proper preparation would likely prove fatal, and that their first priority should be locating the original binding seal and ring described in Hakim's old chronicle, since restoring or repairing that binding offered the only reliable method of containing such a powerful jinn that she knew of. Tariq relayed this plan to the wali, hoping that Amina's involvement might finally convince Rashid to authorize a more substantial response than his previous cautious half-measures had allowed. Rashid, visibly shaken by the guard's death and the rapidly spreading panic now threatening the city's entire economic stability, finally agreed to fund a small expedition to search the old palace ruins believed to lie somewhere beyond the city's southern boundary, in the deep desert where Hakim's chronicle suggested Malik Zuhair's original kingdom had once stood before its eventual collapse and burial beneath the shifting sands. Rashid insisted, however, on sending his own representative to oversee the expedition, a recently arrived traveling sheikh named Walid al-Ghafari who claimed considerable experience dealing with jinn affliction in his travels across other troubled regions, a claim Tariq found himself instinctively distrusting despite having no specific evidence yet to justify his unease. Sheikh Walid presented himself as a confident, well-traveled exorcist, dressed in fine robes that seemed somewhat impractical for desert travel, speaking with an easy, persuasive charm that had apparently already won him considerable favor with the wali during the brief days since his arrival in Az Zara. Tariq found his confidence less reassuring than Walid clearly intended, noting the way his eyes lingered a little too long on any mention of Malik Zuhair's lost ring, and the way he seemed considerably more interested in the treasure such an ancient royal tomb might contain than in the actual danger the freed djinn currently posed to the city's residents. Sita Mina shared Tariq's wariness, though she said little about it openly, preferring instead to observe Walid carefully during their preparation for the expedition rather than confront him directly without firmer evidence of whatever true motives he might be concealing beneath his confident exterior. She told Tariq privately, the night before their departure, that true exorcists she had known throughout her long career tended toward humility rather than the kind of easy, performative confidence Walid displayed at every opportunity. Despite their shared misgivings, neither of them could refuse Walid's involvement without the Wali's continued support for the expedition, and so the three of them, along with a small escort of city guards, set out from Az Zara's southern gate at dawn 3 days later, following the faint, ancient trail markers Hakim's old chronicle suggested might lead toward the buried ruins of Malik Zuhair's lost kingdom. The journey into the deep desert proved harder than Tariq had anticipated, the dunes shifting constantly beneath their camels' feet in ways that made even the most experienced guide among their escort uncertain whether they followed any reliable path at all. On the second night of travel, a sudden, violent sandstorm rose without warning from the otherwise calm evening sky, forcing the entire party to shelter desperately behind whatever rock formations they could find, the wind howling with an intensity that struck Tariq as far too deliberate to belong to ordinary desert weather. Sita Mina, huddled beside him in the storm's chaos, shouted over the wind that she believed the djinn itself had caused the disturbance, sensing their approach toward its original prison and attempting, through whatever influence it could still exert from the city, to delay or destroy their expedition before it ever reached the ruins. Tariq found this explanation deeply unsettling, given how far they had already traveled from Az Zara and how powerful a creature would need to be to extend its influence so completely across such considerable distance. The storm finally passed after several hours, leaving the party shaken, several of their supplies lost to the wind, but otherwise intact enough to continue their journey once dawn finally broke clear and calm over the settling dunes, the buried ruins, according to Hakim's directions, now lying less than a day's travel ahead of them. They reached the ruins of Malik Zuhair's lost kingdom by midday, a vast, half-buried complex of weathered stone columns and collapsed walls protruding from the dunes like the bones of some long-dead giant, far more extensive than Tariq had imagined from Hakim's brief and fragmentary chronicle. At the complex's center, partially exposed by centuries of shifting sand, stood the entrance to what appeared to be a royal tomb, its heavy stone door carved with the same worn symbols Tariq had glimpsed on the broken seal beneath Imran's shop. Sheikh Walid moved immediately toward the tomb entrance with an eagerness that struck Tariq as considerably more enthusiastic than caution should have allowed, and Sita Mina called out a warning that they should examine the entrance carefully for any remaining protective wards before disturbing it further, a warning Walid acknowledged only with a dismissive wave of his hand as he continued forward regardless. The heavy stone door gave way more easily than its apparent age suggested it should, swinging inward on hinges that, despite centuries of disuse, still moved with an unsettling smoothness, revealing a dark passage descending into the tomb's depths, carrying with it the same cool, mineral-laden air that had marked every previous site connected to the djinn's long imprisonment beneath Az Zara's foundations. The tomb's interior chamber, when they finally reached it after a long, careful descent through narrow stone passages, held the remains of what had clearly once been a king's final resting place, the skeletal remains of Malik Zuhair himself laid out upon a stone platform surrounded by the remnants of once magnificent funerary goods, now reduced by centuries to little more than dust and corroded fragments. At the skeleton's withered hand, still wearing what remained of a heavy ring, lay the object Hakim's chronicle had described as essential to the original binding ritual. Sheikh Walid reached the ring first, prying it free from the ancient king's brittle finger with a careless eagerness that made Tariq's stomach turn, and as he lifted it into the chamber's dim torchlight, all three of them saw clearly that the ring's central seal stone had cracked cleanly down its center, exactly mirroring the damage Tariq had found in the broken seal beneath Imran's shop, suggesting some connection between the two objects that none of them yet fully understood. Sita Mina examined the cracked ring carefully, her expression growing increasingly troubled, and told Tariq quietly that a binding ritual performed with damaged components, while still potentially useful, would likely prove considerably weaker than whatever original power Malik Zuhair had used to imprison the jinn the first time. A limitation that might mean their efforts could only contain the creature temporarily rather than destroy or permanently restrain it. Sheikh Walid's behavior shifted noticeably once the ring was finally in his possession, his earlier confident charm giving way to something colder and more calculating as he studied the cracked seal stone with an intensity that suggested considerably more personal interest than simple professional curiosity. When Sid Amina asked him directly to hand the ring over for safekeeping until they could properly assess its remaining ritual power, Walid refused, claiming, with a thin smile that did little to reassure either of them, that his own experience made him better suited to determine the artifact's continued usefulness. Tariq's suspicions, growing steadily since their first meeting, finally crystallized into open distrust, and he demanded more directly that Walid explain exactly what training and experience qualified him for handling an object of such obvious danger. Walid's answer, delivered with a sudden, unsettling shift in tone, revealed considerably more than he likely intended, admitting that he had traveled specifically toward Az-Zara after hearing rumors of an ancient jinn binding, hoping to claim whatever power such an artifact might offer him personally rather than out of any genuine concern for the city's suffering residents. Before either Tariq or Amina could respond to this confession, the tomb chamber's torchlight flickered violently, and a low, rolling laugh echoed from somewhere deep within the surrounding darkness, a sound that Tariq recognized immediately, with cold dread, as belonging to the same patient, mocking voice he had heard following him through the alleys of Az-Zara weeks earlier. The jinn manifested fully within the tomb chamber for the first time, its form coalescing from the surrounding shadows into something tall and terrible, vaguely human in its overall shape but composed of shifting black smoke shot through with veins of dull, ember-like light, its eyes burning with the same fierce orange glow that had scorched the eyes of every victim it had claimed across the city above. It addressed them directly, its voice carrying the same grinding, ancient quality Tariq had begun to associate with creatures far older than any living memory could properly comprehend. It spoke first to Sheikh Walid, recognizing immediately, with what sounded like genuine amusement, the greed that had driven him into the tomb ahead of any nobler purpose, and it told him, almost conversationally, that mortal greed had always proven the easiest weakness to exploit across the many centuries of its long, patient existence. Walid backed away from the creature in obvious terror, the ring still clutched tightly in his trembling hand, his earlier confidence collapsing entirely in the face of the very power he had hoped to claim for himself. Tariq, watching this exchange unfold, understood with sudden, sickening clarity that the jinn had allowed their entire expedition to proceed unhindered specifically because it wanted the ring recovered from Malik Zuhair's tomb, recognizing that whatever damage the centuries had done to the seal stone made it considerably less dangerous to the jinn's continued freedom than leaving it buried and forgotten beneath the desert sand. The jinn moved toward Sheikh Walid with a speed that belied its smoke-like form, and Walid's desperate attempt to flee carried him only a few steps before the creature's smoke wrapped around him entirely, drawing a scream from his throat that cut off abruptly as the ember light within the jinn's form flared brilliant and terrible for one brief, blinding moment. When the light faded, Walid's body collapsed to the tomb's stone floor, his eyes burned black exactly as Imran, Hanan, and Faris had been burned, the cracked ring rolling free from his lifeless fingers to land near Tariq's feet. The jinn, it seemed, had grown considerably bolder and more destructive in their absence, no longer content with the careful, isolated deaths it had inflicted in the weeks before their expedition began. Tariq found the Wali in a state of genuine panic upon their return, Rashid's earlier careful composure entirely abandoned in the face of a crisis now threatening to overwhelm the city's entire population rather than remain contained to isolated, individual deaths. Rashid demanded to know immediately whether their expedition had succeeded in recovering any means of stopping the creature, and Tariq, showing him the cracked ring Amina still carried carefully wrapped in protective cloth, explained honestly that they possessed only a damaged, uncertain tool rather than any guaranteed solution. Rashid authorized whatever resources Tariq and Amina required without further hesitation, abandoning entirely his earlier insistence on discretion and careful public messaging now that the jinn's escalating attacks had made any pretense of normalcy impossible to maintain. Amina requested access to the old, abandoned well Tariq had identified weeks earlier, believing, based on her study of the original chronicle, that the binding ritual would need to be performed at the precise location of the jinn's original imprisonment to have any meaningful chance of success. That location, she confirmed grimly after consulting Hakim's records once more, lay directly beneath the central souk, in the same hidden chamber Imran's careless digging had first broken open weeks earlier, meaning their final confrontation with the creature would need to take place in the very spot where this entire terrible sequence of events had originally begun. Amina spent the following day and night preparing carefully for the ritual, gathering specific herbs, oils, and consecrated materials her family's tradition required for binding work, while Hakim assisted by translating the remaining legible portions of the Old Chronicle's ritual instructions as precisely as the damaged text allowed. Tariq, meanwhile, worked with Samir and the city guard to evacuate the souk and surrounding quarters as thoroughly as possible, hoping to limit the number of potential victims should the confrontation prove as violent as he feared it inevitably would. During this preparation, Hakim shared one additional detail from the chronicle that he had previously overlooked amid the document's damaged and fragmentary condition, a passage suggesting that the jinn's original binding had required not only the physical seal and ring but also the spoken use of its true name, a name the chronicle recorded only in a heavily corrupted form that Hakim had initially dismissed as a legible scribal error rather than genuine, recoverable information. Working through the night with painstaking care, Hakim finally reconstructed the name from the corrupted text, comparing it against several related linguistic patterns from older regional dialects he had studied throughout his long scholarly career. He presented the result to Tariq and Amina just before dawn, a single word that felt strange and heavy on the tongue even simply reading it aloud. The jinn's true name, as best Hakim could reconstruct it, was Halak. Amina explained, upon hearing the recovered name, that speaking a jinn's true name during a binding ritual granted considerable additional power over the creature, forcing a measure of compelled attention and vulnerability that even the strongest jinn could not entirely resist, regardless of how much time had passed since the name was last spoken aloud with proper ritual intent. She warned, however, that using the name incorrectly or with insufficient preparation could provoke a violent, immediate response from the creature rather than the submission the ritual intended to compel. Tariq asked her directly whether she believed their combined preparation, the cracked ring, the reconstructed name, and her own family's inherited ritual knowledge, would prove sufficient to fully destroy the jinn rather than merely contain it temporarily, as she had previously warned might be the limit of their damaged tool's capability. Amina's answer was honest rather than reassuring. She told him that true destruction of a jinn as ancient and powerful as Halak likely lay beyond any ritual available to them, and that their realistic goal should be containment or banishment, driving the creature from Az-Zara entirely rather than hoping to end its existence outright. This sobering acknowledgement settled heavily over both of them as the sun finally rose on the day they had chosen for their final confrontation, neither one fully certain whether their carefully assembled preparations would prove sufficient even for the more limited goal Amina had described. They descended into the hidden chamber beneath Imran's old shop just after midday, accompanied only by Hakim and a small group of guards positioned to maintain the evacuation perimeter above rather than enter the chamber itself, since Amina insisted that too many people present during the ritual would only complicate its delicate balance of focus and intent. The chamber felt colder than Tariq remembered from his earlier exploration, the cracked stone seal still lying half buried in rubble exactly where his investigation had first discovered it weeks earlier. Amina arranged her ritual materials carefully around the seal's broken edges, instructing Tariq to hold the cracked ring at the ready while she began the lengthy preparatory recitations her family's tradition required before any direct confrontation with the bound creature itself. The air in the chamber grew steadily heavier as she worked, a pressure building behind Tariq's ears that he recognized, with rising dread, as the same sensation he had felt during the sandstorm in the deep desert days earlier, confirming that the jinn had already sensed their presence and preparations. Halak manifested fully within the chamber just as Amina completed her final preparatory recitation, its smoke and ember form filling the confined space with a heat that made the stale underground air shimmer visibly, its burning eyes fixed directly on the cracked ring Tariq held trembling in his outstretched hand. The djinn spoke first, its grinding voice filling the chamber with an intensity that seemed to vibrate through the stone walls themselves, addressing Amina directly with what sounded almost like respect for her evident knowledge and preparation, a marked contrast to the contemptuous amusement it had shown toward Sheikh Walid in the desert tomb. It told her that it recognized the old binding tradition she carried, having encountered similar practitioners across the long centuries of its existence, though it warned her, with chilling confidence, that no binding performed with such damaged tools could hope to match the power that had originally imprisoned it. Amina did not respond directly to this taunt, instead beginning the binding ritual's central recitation, her voice steady despite the obvious strain the chamber's oppressive heat and pressure placed upon her concentration. Tariq, following her earlier instruction precisely, spoke the reconstructed name Hakim had recovered from the old chronicle, forcing the word out clearly despite his own racing fear, watching as the djinn's burning eyes widened with sudden, genuine surprise at hearing a name it had clearly not expected any mortal in this current age to have recovered. Halak's form convulsed visibly at the sound of its own true name, the ember light within its smoke flaring and dimming erratically, and for the first time since their confrontation began, Tariq saw something in the creature's burning eyes that looked unmistakably like pain rather than mere amusement or contempt. The djinn's convulsions gave Amina the opening her ritual required, and she pressed the cracked ring, taken from Tariq's trembling hand, directly against the broken stone seal at the chamber's center, completing the physical gesture her family's tradition demanded alongside the spoken recitation and the creature's true name. A wave of pale, cold light spread outward from the point of contact, considerably weaker than whatever Tariq imagined the original binding centuries earlier must have produced, but unmistakably real and unmistakably affecting the struggling djinn before them. Halak's massive smoke form began compressing inward under the spreading light's influence, its furious roar of protest shaking loose small fragments of stone from the chamber's ancient ceiling, and for a brief, hopeful moment Tariq believed their weakened tools might prove sufficient after all to fully restrain the creature exactly as the original binding once had. But the cracked seal stone, unable to bear the full strain of containing such ancient, powerful fury, shattered entirely under the pressure, scattering fragments across the chamber floor and breaking the spreading light's careful pattern before it could complete its work. Amina cried out in frustrated despair as the binding structure collapsed, and Halak, freed from the ritual's incomplete grip though clearly weakened and in obvious pain from the partial containment it had briefly suffered, turned its burning eyes toward them with renewed, furious intent. Tariq understood, in the chaos following the seal's shattering, that their original plan of fully binding the djinn had failed beyond any hope of recovery using the tools currently available to them, and that their only remaining option lay in somehow driving the weakened, wounded creature away from the city entirely rather than continuing to pursue a destruction or full restraint that their damaged ritual components could no longer hope to achieve. He shouted this realization to Amina over the chamber's continuing chaos, and she, recognizing the truth of his assessment even through her evident disappointment, shifted immediately into the considerably simpler banishment recitation her tradition also preserved, one requiring less precise physical ritual but correspondingly weaker, more temporary results. Halak, weakened by the partial binding but still possessing considerably more raw power than either Tariq or Amina could hope to overcome through direct confrontation, lashed out with a wave of searing heat that forced both of them backward against the chamber's stone walls, the air itself shimmering with an intensity that threatened to ignite the wooden support beams Imran's original digging had left exposed throughout the hidden space. Amina continued her banishment recitation despite the danger, her voice rising in volume and urgency as she pushed through the ritual's remaining passages, while Tariq, recognizing that he could offer no further useful contribution to the spoken ritual itself, gathered the scattered fragments of the broken seal stone from the chamber floor, hoping their residual power, however diminished, might still add some small measure of additional force to Amina's continuing effort. Tariq pressed the gathered seal fragments directly against the djinn's smoke form as Amina's recitation reached its climactic final passage, and the contact produced a fresh wave of pale light, weaker than the original binding attempt but still unmistakably affecting Halak's already weakened, partially restrained state. The creature's furious roar shifted into something that sounded, for the first time, genuinely uncertain, its massive form beginning to waver and thin at its edges as the combined pressure of Amina's recitation and the seal fragment's residual power finally began to overwhelm its capacity to maintain full physical manifestation within the chamber. In this moment of weakness, something unexpected happened. Halak spoke again, its voice considerably quieter and less commanding than before, addressing Tariq directly with words that carried, unmistakably, a note of genuine grievance rather than mere predatory malice. It told him that Malik Zuhair had bound it unjustly centuries earlier, exploiting a moment of vulnerability after a great battle to enslave a creature that had owed the Sorcerer King no debt and had committed no crime against his kingdom beyond simply existing within reach of his ambition. Tariq, even amid the chamber's continuing chaos, found himself momentarily struck by the unexpected, almost pleading quality in the jinn's words, recognizing in them a genuine grievance that complicated, without entirely excusing, the considerable suffering Halak had inflicted upon Az Zara's innocent residents since its accidental release weeks earlier. Amina's recitation finished its final passage just as Tariq processed the full weight of what Halak had revealed, and the chamber filled with a sudden, blinding burst of pale light that forced both of them to shield their eyes against its intensity. When the light finally faded, the jinn's massive form had compressed entirely into a thin, dissipating trail of dark smoke, no longer holding any recognizable shape, drifting slowly upward through the chamber's broken ceiling toward the surface far above. Amina collapsed against the chamber wall, exhausted by the ritual's considerable demands, and told Tariq, once she had recovered enough breath to speak clearly, that they had succeeded only in banishment rather than the destruction or permanent binding they had originally hoped to achieve. Halak, she explained, had been driven from Az Zara's foundations and forcibly expelled from its physical manifestation within the city, but the creature itself, weakened and wounded though it clearly was, almost certainly still existed somewhere beyond the city's boundaries, free to eventually recover its strength and potentially trouble some other unfortunate settlement in the future. Tariq considered Halak's parting words about Malik Zuhair's original injustice, wondering whether a creature carrying such a genuine, ancient grievance might ever find peace, or whether its long centuries of imprisonment and subsequent fury had already carried it too far beyond any possibility of resolution that did not involve further suffering for whatever innocent people it eventually encountered next. The immediate aftermath in Az Zara brought considerable relief alongside lingering grief and uncertainty. No further deaths or fires occurred in the days following the banishment, and the Wali, Rashid, quickly moved to restore public confidence by quietly funding repairs to the damaged neighborhoods and offering compensation to the families of those who had died during the weeks of Halak's freedom, though he insisted, even now, on framing the entire crisis publicly as an unusual and tragic outbreak of illness rather than acknowledging the true supernatural cause Tariq and Amina had confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt. Tariq found himself increasingly troubled by this continued official silence, recognizing the same pattern of careful, protective denial he had encountered from the Wali since the very first days of his investigation, but he also understood, with growing weary acceptance, that most of the city's residents preferred the comfort of a mundane explanation over the unsettling truth he and Amina alone had been forced to confront directly within the hidden chamber beneath Imran's old shop. Hakim, for his part, dedicated himself in the weeks that followed to thoroughly documenting everything they had learned about Halak's history and the binding ritual's partial success, hoping that future generations, should the creature ever return to trouble Az Zara again, might benefit from a considerably more complete record than the fragmentary chronicle that had nearly cost their own expedition everything during its initial, dangerous gaps in crucial information. Sit Amina returned to her quiet practice near the southern gate, though her standing within the city had shifted considerably since the crisis. Residents who had previously dismissed her folk healing traditions as mere superstition now approaching her with a new, respectful caution that she accepted with characteristic modesty rather than any visible satisfaction at her vindication. She told Tariq, during one of his frequent visits in the weeks following the banishment, that she took no particular pride in what they had accomplished together, given how incomplete their victory had ultimately proven against a creature she believed would inevitably trouble some other unfortunate city eventually. Tariq found himself unable to fully set aside his concern for whatever fate awaited Halak beyond Az Zara's boundaries, troubled by the genuine grievance the djinn had voiced even amid its considerable cruelty toward the city's innocent residents. He raised this concern with Amina directly, asking whether she believed a creature wronged so unjustly centuries earlier might ever find some path toward peace rather than continuing its long cycle of imprisonment, release, and renewed violence against whatever innocent people happened to disturb its resting place next. Amina's answer offered little comfort. She told him that ancient grievances, left to fester across centuries of imprisonment, rarely resolve themselves into anything resembling reasonable peace, and that Halak's continued existence, wherever it eventually settled, would almost certainly bring suffering to others regardless of how legitimate its original complaint against Malik Zuhair might once have been. The city of Az Zara gradually returned to its ordinary rhythms over the following months, the souk reopening fully once the wali's compensation efforts and careful public messaging had largely restored the merchants' confidence in conducting their normal trade. Tariq returned to his official duties as mutasib, though he found the work considerably less satisfying than it had once seemed before the weeks of investigation that had forced him to confront dangers far beyond anything his original training had ever prepared him to handle. He maintained his friendship with both Hakim and Amina in the months that followed, the three of them meeting periodically to discuss whatever additional fragments of old chronicle or folk tradition each of them encountered in their continuing, informal effort to better understand the true nature of djinn and the various ancient bindings scattered across the wider region, knowledge they all agreed might prove valuable should Halak, or some similar creature, eventually trouble another city the way it had troubled their own. Tariq also made a point of visiting Imran's old shop periodically, now reopened under new ownership after the original merchant's distant relatives had finally settled his estate, finding a strange, somber comfort in standing within the space where this entire terrible sequence of events had first begun, the hidden chamber beneath now permanently sealed with fresh stone and mortar at the wali's careful instruction. A full season passed before Tariq received word, through the wider network of merchant gossip that traveled along the caravan routes connecting Az Zara to other distant settlements, of strange deaths occurring in a city far to the east, a place he had never visited himself but knew by reputation as a prosperous trading post considerably larger than his own home city. The reports described, in the cautious, second-hand manner such rumors always traveled, a series of unexplained deaths marked by burned eyes and unexplained desert sand found in locked, sealed rooms, details that struck Tariq immediately with a cold, familiar dread. He brought this news directly to Amina and Hakim, both of whom recognized the pattern just as quickly as Tariq himself had, confirming their shared, unspoken fear that Halak, weakened by its banishment from Az Zara but far from destroyed, had simply traveled onward across the desert until it found a new, unsuspecting city to trouble, exactly as Amina had warned might happen in the immediate aftermath of their incomplete victory months earlier. Tariq considered, briefly, whether he bore any responsibility to warn the distant city directly of what likely stalked their streets, but Hakim pointed out, with practical reluctance, that any message they sent would almost certainly be dismissed exactly as the wali had initially dismissed Tariq's own early warnings, leaving the distant city's own eventual investigators to discover the truth through the same difficult, dangerous path Tariq's own party had been forced to walk. Tariq nonetheless drafted a careful letter, addressed generally to whatever authority might receive it, describing in measured, factual terms the pattern of deaths Az Zara had endured and the eventual, partially successful method his own party had used to banish the responsible creature from the city. He entrusted the letter to a reliable caravan merchant traveling east, with instructions to deliver it directly to whatever local official proved willing to receive such an unusual warning seriously, though he held little genuine confidence that the letter would arrive in time to prevent whatever suffering Halak's renewed hunger had already begun inflicting on its new, unsuspecting victims. He found himself thinking often, in the weeks following this decision, about the particular shape such suffering likely took in that distant city, imagining some unfortunate shopkeeper or innocent bride discovering exactly the kind of terror that had first drawn him into this entire ordeal months earlier, the burned eyes, the unexplained sand, the rising panic spreading through unfamiliar streets exactly as it had once spread through his own beloved Izizara. Amina reminded him gently, during one of their continuing conversations, that he had done everything reasonably possible to protect his own city and could not be expected to personally prevent every future tragedy a creature as ancient and powerful as Halak might eventually inflict across whatever distant lands it chose to wander through in the long centuries still presumably remaining to its unnatural existence. The merchant carrying Tariq's letter returned to Azizara several months later, reporting that he had delivered it successfully to the eastern city's own market authority, though he had no way of knowing whether the recipients had taken its warnings seriously or dismissed them, as Hakim had predicted, as the ravings of a superstitious distant stranger with no credible standing in their own affairs. Tariq accepted this uncertain outcome as the most he could reasonably hope to achieve, recognizing that some dangers simply could not be fully prevented, only documented and passed forward in the hope that future generations might benefit from knowledge his own painful experience had purchased at considerable cost. He continued his work as mutasib for several more years, eventually rising to a more senior position within the city's administration, though he never again encountered anything resembling the supernatural danger that had defined those few terrible weeks of his early career. He married, eventually, and raised a family of his own within Azizara's now thoroughly ordinary, peaceful streets, though he made certain, as his own children grew old enough to understand such things, to share with them the careful, factual account he and Hakim had preserved of everything that had once threatened their home city. Sid Amina lived to a considerable age, continuing her healing practice and informal study of jinn lore until her final years, training a young apprentice in her family's protective traditions to ensure the knowledge would survive beyond her own eventual passing, should Azizara or some neighboring city ever require it again in the future. Far to the east, in the city the merchant's caravan route had eventually carried Tariq's careful warning toward, a young spice merchant named Karim locked the door of his shop just as the evening call to prayer faded over unfamiliar rooftops, entirely unaware of any letter that may or may not have reached the appropriate authorities regarding dangers that history, repeating itself with patient, indifferent cruelty, had already begun setting into motion within his own city's ancient, undisturbed foundations. Karim had recently expanded his shop's storage capacity, digging eagerly into the cool earth beneath his floor to accommodate a particularly large shipment expected with the coming season's caravans, breaking through, during his enthusiastic excavation, into a forgotten chamber whose existence no living resident of his city had any reason to suspect lay quietly beneath their busy, prosperous streets. He noticed nothing unusual that evening as he settled into his usual chair behind the counter, reviewing the day's modest profits by lamplight, though a faint, cool draft seemed to rise periodically from somewhere beneath the floorboards, carrying with it a subtle mineral scent he attributed, without much further thought, to the ordinary dampness of newly disturbed earth. Halak had traveled far across the desert in the months since its banishment from Azizara, its strength gradually recovering with each passing week of freedom, its ancient fury undiminished despite the considerable setback it had suffered within that hidden chamber beneath Imran's old shop. It had wandered for a time without clear purpose, weakened and wary, before sensing, with the same patient, predatory awareness that had once allowed it to study Tariq's investigation from careful hiding for weeks before finally manifesting directly, the familiar resonance of another ancient seal weakening somewhere far to the east, disturbed by the same kind of careless, ordinary human ambition that had originally freed it from Malik Zuhair's long-forgotten prison. It did not rush toward this new opportunity, having learned, through its painful encounter with Tariq's small but determined resistance, that patience and careful observation served its purposes considerably better than reckless, immediate aggression. It settled instead into the shadows surrounding Karim's newly excavated shop, watching the unsuspecting merchant go about his evening routine with the same detached, calculating interest it had once shown toward Imran in the final weeks before that first, fateful death back in Azizara. The grievance Malik Zuhair's ancient cruelty had planted within it centuries earlier remained as bitter and unresolved as ever, and Halak understood, with the cold certainty only such vast, patient age could provide, that this new city, like the one before it, would soon learn exactly how dangerous that long unresolved fury truly remained. Karim closed his account books for the evening, entirely unaware of the presence watching him from the shadows beyond his shop's modest lamplight, and rose to begin his usual closing routine, checking the door's lock and extinguishing the lamps one by one as he had done every evening for the past several years of running his small but steadily growing business. He paused briefly near the trapdoor leading to his newly expanded cellar, considering whether to inspect his recent excavation work one final time before retiring for the night, but decided, given the late hour, that the inspection could easily wait until morning. This small, ordinary decision, made without any awareness of its true significance, would prove to be the final choice Karim ever made as a man whose eyes had not yet been burned black by an ancient fury he had unknowingly disturbed weeks earlier through nothing more than reasonable, ambitious business planning. He locked his shop's front door behind him as always, extinguished the final lamp, and settled into the same chair he had occupied every evening since opening his business, entirely unaware that he would never rise from it again under his own power. Outside, in the gathering darkness of the unfamiliar city's quiet evening streets, the same cool wind that had once carried Halak's mocking laughter through the alleys of Zara now drifted silently around Karim's locked shop, carrying with it the first faint traces of pale, fine desert sand that no recent storm in this distant city could possibly explain. The following morning, Karim's young apprentice arrived before dawn exactly as Imran's own apprentice once had, intending to open the shop for the day's early trade, and found instead a scene that would soon spread through this new, unfamiliar city's markets with the same rapid, fearful urgency that had once gripped Zara in the wake of Imran's own mysterious death. The boy's screams brought neighboring merchants running, and within hours, the entire quarter buzzed with frightened speculation about what could possibly have killed a healthy young man within his own securely locked shop, leaving behind no wound, no struggle, and no explanation beyond burned, hollow eyes and an inexplicable scattering of fine desert sand across the otherwise undisturbed floor. This new city's local authorities, much like Rashid before them, initially favored mundane explanations over anything resembling the truth, attributing the death to illness or perhaps some rare and unfortunate poison rather than entertain notions of supernatural involvement that respectable officials preferred to dismiss as superstitious nonsense unworthy of serious consideration. Tariq's carefully worded letter, delivered months earlier through the considerable distance of caravan trade routes, sat largely forgotten in some administrative archive, its warnings unread by whatever local investigator might eventually find themselves confronting exactly the same confusing, terrifying pattern Tariq himself had once navigated alone. Whether this new city's eventual response would prove more effective than Zara's own slow, reluctant acknowledgement of the true danger threatening its residents remained, for now, entirely uncertain, dependent on whether some local equivalent of Tariq's stubborn curiosity and Amina's inherited protective knowledge happened to exist among its own population, ready to take up a fight that history seemed determined to repeat across whatever distant cities Halak's ancient, unresolved fury eventually chose to wander through next. Back in Zara, Tariq learned of Karim's death several weeks later through the same merchant gossip network that had originally carried his warning letter eastward, confirming with grim, unsurprised certainty that Halak had indeed found a new city to trouble exactly as he and Amina had feared since the moment they first recognized the eastern reports describing burned eyes and unexplained sand months earlier. He shared this news with Amina and Hakim during one of their regular continuing conversations, and all three of them sat for a long moment in heavy, contemplative silence, understanding the weight of what this confirmation truly meant for whatever innocent residents now found themselves facing the same terror their own city had only narrowly survived. Amina suggested, after some consideration, that they prepare a more detailed account of everything they had learned about Halak, the binding ritual, the cracked seal stone, and the creature's true name, intending to send this expanded knowledge eastward in hopes that it might reach whoever eventually took up the difficult task of confronting the djinn within its new, unsuspecting home, offering them considerably more guidance than Tariq's own brief original warning letter had managed to provide. Hakim agreed readily, dedicating himself once again to careful documentation, though he admitted, with weary honesty, that he held little genuine confidence the distant city's authorities would prove any more receptive to such warnings than Rashid had initially been toward Tariq's own early, frustrated efforts to convince him of the true danger threatening Az Zara months earlier. The expanded account, once completed, traveled eastward through the same caravan networks that had carried Tariq's original letter, accompanied this time by Hakim's careful transcription of the reconstructed true name, the description of the binding ritual's requirements, and a detailed account of both their partial success and their ultimate, frustrating failure to achieve anything more permanent than temporary banishment against a creature whose ancient grievance remained, as far as any of them could determine, entirely unresolved and likely unresolvable through any means currently available to mortal knowledge. Tariq found himself, in the months following this final effort, settling gradually into a quieter, more contemplative acceptance of everything he had experienced and learned during those terrible weeks of investigation and confrontation. He understood now, with hard-won clarity, that some dangers in the world simply could not be fully eliminated, only managed, documented, and passed forward through careful warning and inherited knowledge, in the hope that each new generation facing such ancient threats might benefit, even slightly, from the painful lessons their predecessors had already learned at considerable cost. He continued his quiet friendship with Amina and Hakim for the remainder of his years, the three of them forming an informal, unofficial circle of knowledge that future residents of Az Zara might draw upon should the city's old, troubled history ever resurface in some new and unexpected form, a possibility none of them could entirely rule out given everything they now understood about the patient, persistent nature of grievances stretching back across so many centuries of bitter, unresolved imprisonment. Halak, meanwhile, continued its slow, deliberate work within its newly chosen city far to the east, claiming victim after victim across the following weeks with the same patient, calculated cruelty it had once shown toward Az Zara, its ancient fury finding fresh, unsuspecting targets among people who had done nothing more than disturb ground that should have remained forever undisturbed, exactly as Imran, Hanan, and Faris once had in a city now many weeks of difficult travel behind it. Whether this new city would eventually find its own version of Tariq's stubborn investigation and Amina's inherited protective knowledge, or whether it would suffer considerably longer and more severely before discovering any effective response at all, remained an open question that only time itself would eventually answer. The djinn felt no particular urgency in this slow, methodical work, understanding, with a patient perspective only centuries of existence could provide, that mortal cities and mortal lifetimes passed quickly enough that it could afford to take whatever time it required to extract whatever measure of satisfaction its ancient, unresolved grievance still demanded before eventually, inevitably, some combination of circumstance and discovery forced it to move onward once again toward yet another, distant, unsuspecting settlement. And so it continued, as it had continued for centuries before reaching Az Zara and would presumably continue for centuries more after finally leaving this new eastern city behind in its turn, carrying its ancient, unresolved fury across the vast, indifferent desert from one unsuspecting city to the next, waiting patiently, always, for the next careless hand to break open ground that should have remained forever sealed, the next innocent shopkeeper to lock his door for what he believed would be an ordinary night, never suspecting that something ancient and burning had already begun, quietly and deliberately, to take notice of him. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, like and subscribe for more. I try to make 2 a day. If you'd like a story you thought of to come to life, I make custom videos. Drop your idea in the comments. See you in the next one.